I'm Barrett Fisher, Associate Dean of Arts and Humanities. I want to welcome you to Primetime at the Library. Primetime at the Bethel University Library's mission is to encourage lifelong learning beyond the classroom with the entire Bethel community as collaboration with friends of the Bethel University Library and many offices on campus. Looking ahead to the presentation on Thursday, February 23rd, there'll be a special presentation by the Friends of the Bethel University Library with President P.W. Carlson. If you know who he is, he's kind of new on campus. And Jim Johnson, Professor of History Emeritus. They'll be sharing their memories and other stories in a presentation entitled Historian as Storyteller. It'll be a great occasion. Today, we are having a presentation occasioned by the Bethel Theatre Department's presentation of the Tony Award-winning musical Urinetown, the musical, which is opening this Thursday night and running through March 3rd. And as a forward to that production, a preparation for that production, we want to welcome Wayne Roosa, Professor of Art, Mark Bruce, Assistant Professor of English, and Meg Zauner, Associate Professor of Theater, as they offer insights into how satire both entertains and educates. And this is called Urinetown, Naughty or Nice.
So I'm Mark. I think the way this is going to go is I'm going to speak sort of more broadly. Satire for a few minutes, and if I say anything offensive, you can do that again. And then Wayne's going to talk a little bit about biblical satire, or satire in the Bible.
The Bible and satire.
The Bible and satire. We're walking this tightrope where this speaking is very difficult to manage. And then Meg is going to talk a little bit about the musical itself. So I'm just going to launch right in. My part's just a red. I don't have visuals. Just my scintillating words. In the survey course that I teach on early British literature, one of the late medieval works I often include is the text of a 14th century English play known as the York Play of the Crucifixion. This play is part of a kind of performance called a mystery cycle. Cycle plays were often performed on feast days, usually in the spring, as part of the civic and religious festivities in medieval English cities. Rather than single plays that were performed on a fixed stage, mystery cycles consisted in a whole series of plays, usually vignettes of key moments in salvation history, starting with the creation and ending with the Last Judgment, each performed on its own movable wagon that processed on a fixed route through the town. So by standing on one street corner, a person could literally watch salvation history process before his or her eyes throughout the course of a single day. One of the interesting things about these plays for me is that they tend to emphasize the human element in scriptural story, in the relationship of we fallen, self-absorbed, often silly human beings to the great history of divine grace that structures the cycles. The York Play of the Crucifixion is a wonderful and to a modern evangelical Midwestern sensibility sometimes alarming example of this kind of focus. The main character in the play is not Christ. Instead, the focus is on the four hapless, working stiff Roman soldiers who just happened to pull the unpleasant duty that day of putting criminals on crosses. None of them wants to be there, and all of them are focused less on salvation time than they are on millet time. The soldiers prove to be not only disinterested, but entirely inept. And most of the play focuses on their Keystone Cop-like antics as they repeatedly try and fail, first to actually affix Jesus to the cross, because some yuts drilled the peg holes too far apart, and then to actually get the cross to stand up, which proves difficult because some other yuts dug the hole too wide. The soldiers are so clueless about the import of what they're doing that they complain about the aches and pains the act of putting up the cross is causing them, even as they artificially stretch Jesus out to fit the badly drilled holes and let the cross swing to and fro in its too wide hole. Since I like to teach plays through informal performance, I often have students actually translate and perform this play in class. The physical performance has the effect of emphasizing the very slapstick physical comedy in the play. So as students watch their colleagues perform sections of the play, some become uncomfortable. Isn't this sacrilegious? aren't we making fun of the crucifixion? Once the class is done performing the play, I'll often ask them to reflect on what they were doing while they watched their colleagues perform. And the main answer to that question, of course, is that they were laughing. And the play is inescapably funny. Certainly medieval audiences laughed as well. But the question that is key to understanding the play and why its purpose is ultimately serious and not at all sacrilegious, I would argue, is this. What were the spectators at the crucifixion doing? According to 3 of the 4 Gospels, that crowd was doing precisely what the York play of the crucifixion forces its spectators to do. They were laughing and jeering. What emerges generally from the discussion of this phenomenon is that what the play is making fun of is not the crucifixion itself, but rather the audience of the crucifixion. And who, among the players in that scene, are we, the medieval and modern audiences of the play, most like? Are we more like the character of Christ, the ultimate suffering servant? Or are we like the soldiers, who, like most folks in the Middle Ages as now, are too bound up in just getting through the stresses and tasks of the day to see the importance of the sacrifice being enacted on their behalf? Or are we more like the audience, jeering and laughing at the suffering that is for them little more than entertaining a spectacle? The play makes the reality of who we are painfully apparent by first making us laugh through the event and then smacking us with Christ's line, "Forgive them, they know not what they do." With that line, the play forces its spectators into a harsh realization of where everyday humans like us stand in relation to the sacrifice of the cross. We're the ones who spend more time worrying about our day and our jobs than registering the enormity of Christ's forgiveness. And we're the ones who spend more time watching suffering a spectacle, The Bachelor, anyone, than being reflective about just what it is with which we entertain ourselves. The purpose of the play, then, far from being an inappropriate spoof of the crucifixion, is really deadly serious. It uses a satirical mode, and I'll explain what that is in a minute, to leverage a realization of what and who we are in relation to Christ's sacrifice. And to our dismay, it turns out that we are not Christ. We are the soldiers. We are the jeering crowd. That realization then carries us into the next play in the cycle, which is about the resurrection, and the reality that we're forgiven, despite the fact that, as Christ so aptly puts it, we never had the foggiest idea what we were doing. At the same time, and here's where I think the function and importance of satire in a Christian consciousness comes in, as much as we human beings run about not knowing what we're doing, we really hate admitting that. We'd much rather think of ourselves as being in control, being knowledgeable, knowing exactly what we're doing, being, in a word, right. In the case of the crucifixion, I think it's safe to say that most of us, myself very much included, tend to walk around thinking as though we have a stronger sense of the crucifixion and its significance than we really do. We revere it, certainly, celebrate it, listen to sermons about it, read accounts of it in the Gospels. But I have a feeling that if we were to truly engage with how radical a thing the crucifixion really is, how astonishing is the idea of the incarnation, suffering, death, and resurrection of Christ the Son in order to reconcile a fallen humanity to the divine, the workaday world in which we live, and even our own lives, would cease to hold the importance with which we seem to enjoy treating them. What this suggests is that we tend to live within and even sometimes cultivate a kind of false consciousness when it comes to how we relate moment by moment to something as mind-shattering as grace. Even though we know intellectually what Christ did and what that means, we tend not to live out that meaning very well. Even as we acknowledge the depth of our debt to Christ on some levels, we still get up, do our work, entertain ourselves, and generally move through the day with the sense that the next course or exam or presentation or task is something important. We engage ourselves, in other words, in the very things that distract us, just as they did the soldiers raising the cross, from the enormity of what's been done for us. What the York play does is leverage us into a recognition of that false consciousness in which we live by exaggerating the situation almost to the point of absurdity, literally juxtaposing the workaday attitudes with which we go through too much of our lives directly with the event of the crucifixion. The clueless working stiffs and entertainment-seeking crowd are literally placed at the foot of the suffering Christ, who forgives us even that. In so doing, the play does not laugh at the crucifixion, but at us, making us laugh. but also, through that very laughter, confronting us with the most consistent and dangerous of human sins, that of pride. And that, I think, is the real purpose of what we call satire. What satire does, and here comes the definition, for those who like definitions, is expose and critique the kind of false consciousness that is engendered by the sin of pride. It does this generally exactly the way the York play does, through irony and exaggeration. It sets our false senses of importance and knowledge, our preciously held ideologies, our senses of rightness and righteousness and purity, against the very things that tend to expose them as false or incomplete, or at least not nearly as fantastic and enlightened and unassailable as we like to think they are. That's the irony part. And then inflates them both to the degree that we cannot fail to see the difference. That's the exaggeration. The conviction comes when we realize, even through our own laughter, that at the end of the day, we are the butts of the joke. And the exaggeration is often quite stark and extreme. The medieval Italian poet Dante Alighieri, whose Divine Comedy is not often thought of as satirical, but which actually fits the above definition pretty well, does it by setting up a very easy-to-read symbolic representation of the Christian moral system in which pretty much everyone of his place and time professed belief, with very specific places denoting specific things that system marked as sins and virtues. And then he drops real historical people into that symbolic framework. The joke, quote unquote, embedded in that structure, as a reader soon realizes, is that it shows up the disconnect between what people say they believe and how they actually behave. Which is why in the Divine Comedy we get some of those the world elects as popes in hell, and some of those whom the world branded as heretics in paradise. Jonathan Swift in Gulliver's Travels uses literal exaggeration of size to make some of his points. The ankle-height people whom Gulliver meets in Lilliput wind up being, in a moral sense, much bigger than Gulliver, even though he ironically doesn't realize it. And the giants with whom he interacts in Brobdingnag wind up being as prone to silliness and small-mindedness as anyone, no matter how big they are. In the land of the Houyhnhnms, the creatures who most embody the highest values to which humanity aspires look exactly like horses, while the yahoos, who look human, act like animals. Mark Twain, in A Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's Court, literally drops a realistically practical-minded American engineer into a storybook caricature of medieval England, who winds up literally blowing up every high-minded symbol of chivalry and nobility you can think of with modern weapons of mass destruction, suggesting in the end that pretensions of chivalric romance can be nothing more than arrogant pretense in a world of firearms and explosives. The method is the same in each case. Exaggeration and juxtaposition create a situation in which the false consciousness created by pride is exposed and critiqued. But okay, Mark, you might, as my Socratic respondent, say, I get satire up to that point. You're suggesting that satire is an okay thing for Christians because, like Christianity, it takes a low view of human knowledge and self-importance and exposes and critiques pride, which Christianity sees as a sin, maybe even the sin. But we're talking about a play called Urinetown, for Pete's sake. I mean, I get the bit about critiquing pride, but come on now, pee jokes? Seriously? Aren't Christians supposed to work toward holiness by maintaining pure minds? And if that's the case, how can we participate in anything that engages in scatological humor, no matter what the goal may be? I suppose my response to this might first include the acknowledgement that satire does often work this way. It tends to work, in other words, by confronting us directly with things that we'd rather not acknowledge because they mark the kinds of illusions that we often desperately hang on to, no matter how unreal they may be. Satirists often try to get to these things by using images of things that are considered taboo, either things that are taboo subjects on their own, like sex, body parts, and human waste, or subjects that are considered taboo to lampoon, like political convictions and religious beliefs. But why is this necessary? An answer, I think, goes back to satire's purpose. If the idea of satire is to expose and critique the false consciousness engendered by pride, it has to do something to get past its spectators' defenses. In other words, we silly humans have such a tendency to want to believe that our lives and ideas are so much more important than they are. that we are so much more knowing and self-sufficient and accomplished than we, saved by grace, really are, that we honestly go to pretty extreme lengths not to confront those things that might suggest that we're not as wonderful and right and pure as we want to think we are. Consequently, satirists tend to have to go to even greater extremes to force us to look at the things we don't want to acknowledge. What a satirist might do, with the suggestion that we can't engage because of a desire to maintain purity of mind in something that uses scatological humor then, might be to ask whether that idea itself might sometimes be engendered by a kind of false consciousness. And this is where my discussion gets a little techie and nerdy, so bear with me for a few minutes here. He might start in the kind of theoretical thinking that goes on, as it were, behind the scenes in the creation of satire, by noticing the degree to which our very ideas of purity and impurity are bound up culturally and linguistically with ideas and language concerning the expulsion and regulation of human waste, which, by the way, is what Urinetown is about. For example, the word purity itself comes from the Latin purus, which literally means free from contamination. For this reason, purus is also the root of many of the words we use for the act of creating purity by separating ourselves from perceived impurities, such as purge. And it's important to note that such words tend simultaneously to have both religious and scatological meanings and uses, such as, in this case, the words purgative, which is the word we use for a laxative drug, and purgatory, a place of spiritual purification between earthly life and heaven. Conversely, words we use to talk about the elimination of waste almost always have roots in the idea of separation of purity from impurity, such as the English excrement, which derives from the participial form of the Latin verb cernare, to separate, whence we also derive words like concern and discernment. The same is true of a word like eliminate, from the Latin limen, which means doorframe or threshold. To eliminate something is to cast it from the civilized, constructed interior space to the wild space outside the door. Defecate derives from the Latin faecula, which is the word for the dregs that collect at the bottom of a wine cask. To defecate is to separate the dregs from the pure wine. Even the roots of our cruder words for the elimination of waste have similar etymologies, but interestingly derive from Germanic rather than Latin origins. So, for instance, the English word crap derives from the Old English krappa, which is the word for the chaff that is sifted from grain. And the English word shit, from the Old English verb skitan, means to separate, split, or divide. Interestingly, neither of these words actually referred to defecation in Old English, which used a much more blatantly descriptive and less metaphorically loaded term, arsegon. I'll leave the rest of that to you. Perhaps relevant to this discussion, too, is the word catharsis, which has Greek origins and also refers to a cleansing from impurity, which is why it's no mistake that catharsis is both a term that we still use in two ways. One, via Aristotle, to describe the desired effect of a theatrical performance on its audience, while the other, cathartic, denotes in medical parlance a drug that forcefully induces bowel movement. The root of all these linguistic relationships, according at least to many anthropologists, is the role that the marking of human waste as something impure plays in the creation of human identities and human cultures themselves. Many believe that such marking of human waste as something offensive and impure, and then casting it outside of the boundaries of a person or a community, is one of the primordial civilizing moves of separating what is me from not me, and us from not us. The theorist Julia Kristeva calls this process one of abjection, also from the Latin jacere, to cast or throw, whereby in order to differentiate a self or a community from an other or a them, we literally and symbolically cast outside of ourselves what we perceive we are not. Because the original version of this process was the casting out of waste as impure, that waste then becomes the very symbol of what we are not, integral to our ideas of who we are as humans, individuals, and communities. The problem here, as Kristeva and others have pointed out, is that if the way we must create a sense of self is to first define an other and separate ourselves from it, that other becomes part of us in the very moment we cast it aside. as important to how we define our identities as anything we consider to be pure or inside, just as human waste is something that is simultaneously part of us, something we generate from within, even as we cast it out as impure. If we define the inside of who we are by first designating an outside or an other, then that other is as paradoxically integral to who we are as it is unspeakable. This is why, from at least some anthropological perspectives, language about human waste itself becomes taboo, not simply because it is something we cast out as impure, but because it is, for that very reason, vitally necessary to our sense of who we are. We can neither speak of it nor live without it, so it sort of haunts us, always ever present, even as we try to mark it off from ourselves, constantly reasserting itself, even as we cast it out. To paraphrase the title of a popular children's book, everybody poops, no matter how much we try to avoid acknowledging that. Working from this knowledge of the inseparability of our ideas of purity from our ideas of waste, and the degree to which the very language we use to address the concept of purity is already bound up with age-old taboos regarding human waste, a satirist might wonder to what degree any insistence on the maintenance of purity can itself be pure, and to what degree the person insisting on purity is aware of that fact. To put it more simply, while a Christian satirist might indeed cherish the value of striving toward holiness, he might also ask whether a person insisting on the value of holiness has forgotten that it's something that he or she actually needs to continue striving for. Is that person really striving for purity, or is the person actually avoiding such striving by instead focusing attention on perceived impurities in others? Is he or she engaging in a real movement toward holiness, or putting up a moralizing smokescreen as an excuse not to do the work of trying? If the satirist feels that the former is the case, everyone can probably relax. If he feels the latter is actually the case, though, look out. The satirist might even feel it his moral duty to point out the error, and in more cases than most of us would like to admit, we will go to great lengths to avoid having our own errors pointed out to us. A satirist, then, will do whatever it takes, including confronting us with the very images of our own impurity we're so desperately trying to our peril not to see, using the rhetorical strategies of satire. He might, for instance, do this by creating a persona of an individual who is so falsely convinced of his or her own purity and also of the impurities of everyone else that she's entirely unaware of the ways in which the very ideas she rails against are already infecting her own language. And he'll make it apparent by ironically exaggerating both sides of this equation. He might, for instance, have that persona in response to Bethel's production of Urinetown exhort her fellow discerning purists to, and now I'm speaking as the satirized persona here, join me in providing the impetus, the very fiber, of a great purgative movement that will expel all such impurities from Bethel, flushing the offending matter of unnecessary reference to private bathroom functions and human waste into the cesspool of sin where they belong. I do not doubt that this may be a laborious process, that there will be great resistance from the pockets of impacted pollution that have been allowed to accumulate in the crooks and defiles of Bethel's moral interior. Indeed, we may find ourselves straining, pushing, even sweating as we bear down to expel such contamination from within. But we must persevere toward the ultimate goal of internal cleansing, so that Bethel may once again be a place that drinks only from the fountains of purity, that it may again sprinkle over the world showers of golden righteousness. What this example attempts to expose and critique here, then, is not the value of purity, but rather the speaker's false consciousness, his or her lack of awareness of the operation of the fall and the embeddedness of that fall in our own language and thought. However, as is the case with Urinetown, I think, not even the satirist escapes his own satire, since the satire itself also points up the degree to which the satirist is pretending to a moral high ground over the satiric persona that by his own moral rhetoric he can't have. In a really successful satire, which I think Urinetown is, no one is safe, and we should all walk away a little uneasy with the patterns of thought we had before opening the book or entering the theater. At the end of the day, perhaps the satirically scatological language that brings about an awareness of our own race may, in this fallen world, be the most purifying concept of all. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Mark. That was not only wonderful, but a little bit of a hard act to follow.
Yeah, I'm relieved.
Sorry. Losing my presentation. Yeah, that's nice. Except I can't see it on my laptop. Huh. Well, all right, we'll see if that will work. I can't, this is black, I'm not sure why. And you're not supposed to see that, so. All right, so thank you, that was terrific, and yeah, you hit every point that needed to be hit, so well, as we were sort of planning this session, and I already warned him, I'm going to blame everything on Barrett Fisher. He came up with the bright idea that I should talk about the Bible in satire and art. And we could accuse Mark's examples of being about the Bible and about faith, but the question is, does the Bible itself do this? We clearly satirize our own religious pretensions, but does the Bible itself satirize? So when Barrett gave me this assignment, I went home and I was sitting at the kitchen table and looking through the Bible for satirical passages. And my wife, Cheryl, came in and said, "What are you doing?" And I told her my assignment. So I said, "I'm looking for Bible passages that are satirical." And she thought for a minute and she said, "So are you just going to make it up?" Which is an indicator of how we probably do get satire and tolerate it. But the closer it gets to Bible, and especially we earnest Protestants, the more nervous we get. And so the question is, does the Bible itself use satire as a form? And if so, then do artists leverage off of that in order to do something satirical? I was raised in that Christian tradition that was quick to point out that the Bible tells us Jesus wept, but it never says he laughed or even smiled. So this is an earnest platform to work out of. And yet one of my heroes was Martin Luther, who said that basically the best way to resist the devil is to mock him, for he's such a proud soul that he cannot bear laughing at himself. And that's really what Mark so beautifully brought out, is this idea that we actually mock or even mock ourselves in order to break our pretensions down and liberate ourselves from our own constructions and pride. So I think we get satire, but there's still that kind of question, does the Bible do it? So that's a good question. I want to start here with a painting by Peter Bruegel called "The Blind Leading the Blind," and that's a phrase from the Bible, right? The blind leading the blind, and we use it. I mean, we look at non-believers and we say, "It's the blind leading the blind." They're fools. Of course, they're not enlightened. And so Peter Bruegel paints that phrase for us: the blind leading the blind. And you've got a set of beggars, a set of poor people, and they're all holding on to each other, and they can't see where they're going, and their leader, has gone off the edge and is tumbling down, and they're all going to tumble in after. So the blind leading the blind, and we say absolutely. And in fact, we even push it further. If the blind leading the blind were spiritually enlightened like us, they would have enough wisdom from the Scripture to not tumble into the pit. And Bruegel says, of course. Back here we have the church, strategically placed at the gap between when they've started to take the plunge because they're such fools that they're not, they're not paying attention to faith. And so we nice, earnest people, confident in our faith, confident in our religious constructions, are quick to cite the biblical phrase, the blind leading the blind. Which is fine unless you actually start reading the Bible and look for that phrase. Well, the Bible does use the phrase. Jesus uses the phrase. He uses it in Matthew 15, where unfortunately the people he's talking to are us religious people. And he's pretty fierce, dare I say, satirical. Then the Pharisees and scribes came to Jesus from Jerusalem and said, "Why do your disciples break the tradition of the elders? For they do not wash their hands before they eat." And Jesus answered them, "Well, why do you break the commandments of God for the sake of your tradition?" And he's putting into play this exact thing that Mark was talking about so nicely. For God said, "Honor your father and your mother, and whoever speaks evil of father and mother must surely die." But you say that whoever tells father or mother, "Whatever support I might have given you, I've given to God," and then that person need not honor the father. So for the sake of your tradition, your religious consciousness, you make void the very word of God. You hypocrites! Isaiah prophesied rightly about you when he said, "This people honors me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. In vain do they worship me, teaching human precepts as doctrines." Then the disciples later approached Jesus and said to him, "Do you know that the Pharisees took offense?" They took offense when they heard what you said. And he answered them, "Every plant that my heavenly Father has not planted will be uprooted. Let them alone. They are blind guides of the blind. If one blind guide guides another, both will fall into the pit." So it's exactly the kind of setup Mark was saying. We can piously look at these fools, these poor people that are leading themselves into the pit, and we're smug and we're pleasant, and we say, if only they had religion, they wouldn't be so foolish. And then Bruegel does his satirical move. He flips the whole thing on us, because if you're actually paying attention to the scripture, Jesus doesn't use the phrase that way. If you actually pay attention to the painting, you'll notice that all these trees are full of leaves. But there's one tree, the tree that's silhouetted against the church, that's producing no fruit. And this, of course, is our pride, right? Our righteousness, looking at that. And so Bruegel kind of flips the whole situation on us. And we're sort of caught holding our own pride. So that's nice, but is that passage, is the actual Bible passage satirical? Or is this just our dynamic with it? And so the question starts to be a little bit more interesting. Now, I hope I'm going to be able to... This is actually a problem if I can't get these images to work. Well, we need computer guys that know why my screen is black.
I'm going to have to go into preference.
No, go ahead. Sorry about this. I was getting nervous watching that little thing saying it was going to sleep while Mark was talking. We could read something from Urinetown. Or I could, since we're running out of time, I could cut to the chase, which is too bad. So I'll describe for you the next image. Along the lines of Jesus kind of reaming us out for our pride and our false, piety and consciousness, is this great passage in Matthew 23, and I'm blaming this on my theologian friends. They told me to use this. Where he's basically saying, woe to you scribes and Pharisees, you're so concerned with how you appear to everyone. You're so concerned with, looking right. And he actually says to the crowd and to his disciples, the teachers of the law and the Pharisees sit in Moses' seat. So you must obey them. You must do everything they tell you. But don't do what they do. They don't practice what they preach. They tie up heavy loads and put them on other people's shoulders. They put themselves, but they themselves aren't willing to lift a finger to move them. Everything they do is done for others to see. On their foreheads and arms, they wear little boxes that hold scriptures. And they make those boxes very wide. And they make those tassels on their coats very long. I mean, this is satire at its best. And there we are. Thank you. And so can you just see these guys? So here's a print by Paul Klee. It is entitled "Two Men Meeting Each Other, Neither Sure of Who Holds the Higher Rank." And it's so to the spirit of the way Jesus kind of pricks the pride and the piety and the observing of laws and observances and so on. And I love these two guys. They basically, neither of them can bow low enough. They're trying to get lower than each other. But now here's the thing. If we exhibited this in the Olson Gallery, we would probably get some pushback because these guys are naked. Okay. Never mind that the satirical meaning calls for their nakedness, because nakedness is a metaphor, of course, for the emptiness of our pride. And that kind of turns us towards this whole business that Mark was pointing out, that for satire to make its punch, it often goes to somewhat extreme or hyperbolic exaggeration. It often goes either to the sacred or the sexual or the scatological in order to make us kind of feel the grip of what they're trying to say. And I think the Bible does that. In fact, there's a number of artists who echo that. Now, none of you, I'm sure, have ever thought of the Good Samaritan as satirical. But there's a few artists that have treated that, and I just threw a few in. And I want to dwell for a moment on two Rembrandts, one of the great painters of the Bible. So here's an earnest portrayal of the Good Samaritan, where Rembrandt puts us at the inn. We have our beaten man, our horse. The poor beaten man's being taken off of the horse, and the Samaritan's up here paying the innkeeper to take care of this man. And that's straight up. That's serious. We feel that, right? But like so many religious listeners, there's always this danger that we're viewing this so piously, where in fact none of us actually have any intention of going out and doing anything this radical. But we feel quite good listening to it. We're stroked by listening to the sermon on that. And Rembrandt understood that about the religious pretensions of his day, and so he had a comment to make. So he treated this a second time in this wonderful etching, where again you have all the drama of that. You even have an onlooker here. This is kind of us, and we're out here. And then it's as if Rembrandt says, really? I mean, are you really so sure that you're so pious? And so he puts this, what is actually an enormous dog. This dog is as big as the horse almost. Squatting down and taking a, what was it, crackle, hearthstone. Straining there, from us. And is it irreverent? Yes. Is it irreverent to the parable? No. Is it irreverent to us, the viewers, who feel we are reverent? Yes. And so he kind of gets you, coming and going. Now, some of you, though, are going to say, that's nice, I like it, I get it, but it's still not actually the Bible being satirical. Is the Bible satirical ever? So let's drop back to Ezekiel, chapter 16. The setting here is that Jerusalem has been unfaithful to God. God's quite angry about it, and so he has the prophet do this verbal setup. Jerusalem is the bride of God. God has clothed his bride, housed his bride, given his bride wealth. And nonetheless, the bride is off being unfaithful. And so the prophet portrays Jerusalem as acting the harlot, the whore. And I dare say the prophet here resorts to hyperbolic, satirical language, except at least as far as I know, anatomically, this is not accurate. So after reaming out the bride, the prophet comes down to saying to her, "You're so bad. You had sex with your big-membered Egyptian neighbors and engaged in fornication over and over just to provoke me. You do these things, behaving like a shameless whore, building your platforms on every street, making your high places in every open place. And yet, you're actually worse than a whore. At least a whore gets paid, but you give it away." And it goes on, and it actually ends with these big-membered Egyptians ejaculating with the force of horses. As I say, I don't have any evidence that that's anatomically correct. It seems to me satirical, hyperbole. Now, some of you are maybe thinking, I don't remember that passage. And most of you would have if you had encountered it. And what I just read to you is from the Hebrew, the Jewish translation. I got thinking, I don't remember that either. So I got looking at the more Protestant translations, and they tone it down. The King James, "Thou hast committed fornication with the Egyptians, thy neighbors, with great flesh." I mean, it's still there, the member's still there, it's with great flesh. The Revised Standard Version, "You also played the harlot with the Egyptians, your lustful neighbors." They've lost their phallus. The Revised Standard Version, "You played the whore with the Egyptians, those lustful neighbors." New International, "You engaged in prostitution with the Egyptians, those lustful neighbors." Now, I was educated by an advisor who was a Freudian, and he said that all men have castration anxiety. And he said that it was basically women that were afraid are going to dismember us. And so, while we've been keeping our eye on women, little did we know that it was Bible translators that were going to dismember us. The member has disappeared in these translations. And if I could just turn this a bit serious for one moment. So I was raised in this earnest tradition. And as I entered college and started really looking hard at the world, I thought the world that my tradition described to me through the Bible is inadequate. And I actually ditched that faith. I gave up being a Christian. When I was a junior, a new translation came out, the New Jerusalem Bible. It's one of those Catholic translations. And Catholics, being sacramental, are a little more comfortable with the body, a little more connected to the Jews that way. And knowing that I was going to be a scholar, I thought, what any scholar would do when he's a junior in college, you're going to read the new translation. And when I read the new translation, I was reading it through, and I came across Ezekiel 16. So here's the Catholic translation. "You have lain down with those big-membered neighbors, the Egyptians, and you've engaged with fornication over and over, those big-membered Egyptians who ejaculate like horses." And I thought, maybe this book's not so uneven. Maybe this book has a description that's adequate to the grit of reality. And bizarre as it may sound, and I'm in the arts, so I'm bizarre. It was the rediscovery of the oversized Egyptian member that turned me back towards saying the Bible might be a description of reality that's worth considering. I bet you've never heard a testimony that has anything to do with that below the belt business, except to condemn it.
Freud was right.
Yeah, but it was the Bible translators that took it away. So, okay, we are out of time. Meg, I'm sorry.
No.
What about anyway?
I'll just say, Urinetown is something that I think will get you to think of things in a different way. One of the lines that one of the characters says really early on is, "So why am I so conflicted?" And that's pretty true. As an audience member, you're conflicted. As the characters, they're conflicted. On one hand, they're doing this, and on the other hand, they're doing this. And it really makes you think in a different way, and it's incredibly funny. So I really hope that you do risk going down there, going to the theater. Only thing I would say is get there on time, or if you come late, you're not going to get in. So thank you so much for, you guys, this was amazing. And you should have a much better idea of what you're getting yourself into before you go to Urinetown. So we hope we see you in the next 2 weeks downstairs at Urinetown. So thanks a lot.